Hi there, I'm John Allen, and welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at the Word on Fire Institute. I am the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news source and your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. You can find us online at cruxnow.com. That's cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find all of their terrific resources online at wordonfire.institute. That is wordonfire.institute. I am coming to you from my home in what has become the global epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, Italy. As of yesterday evening, these numbers will certainly be higher by the time this airs, but Italy had reached the threshold of almost 28,000 cases of coronavirus infection, almost 2,200 deaths, although we also have seen about 2,700 people recovered from the disease. We are in week 2 of a nationwide lockdown. Virtually everything here is closed, except for essential services such as grocery stores and pharmacies. People are being actively discouraged from leaving their homes, except for motives of work, if you were involved in one of those essential services, or for medical necessity, or for life necessities, such as going to the pharmacy or the grocery store. Other than that, Italy is promoting a very aggressive campaign of staying at home. The most popular social media hashtag right now is Io resto a casa, or I'm staying home. The Italian bishops have launched their own version of that. It is Io prego a casa hashtag, which means I'm praying at home. Now, we know the coronavirus does not discriminate, obviously, on the basis of religion, but nevertheless, this pandemic is having massive consequences for Catholic life, including the Vatican. Most immediately, people are scrambling to try to figure out how to deliver routine pastoral care in a time of lockdown. This question presents itself perhaps in most acute form here in Italy, first because we were just earlier out of the gate than much of the rest of the world, and also second, of course, because Italy, despite a century of secularization, is still in many ways a profoundly Catholic nation where turning to the church is a natural instinct in times of crisis. So Pope Francis, for instance, for a week now, has been live streaming his previously private daily Mass at the Domus Santa Marta. That's the residence on Vatican grounds where he lives. It is possible that his major liturgies for Holy Week are going to have to be celebrated without the presence of the faithful. Deeper than that, the situation is creating a kind of tension and ambivalence within the Catholic community about the extent to which the Church ought to make itself available to people during this period. Some believe that the Church ought to be essentially closed for business because inviting people together for religious events risks transmitting the virus. Others believe that the Church is, from the point of view of faith, the Church is an essential service. People need to have access to the sacraments, and therefore, in some way or the other, the Church needs to be out there providing normal pastoral care. Now, this is not a new question for the Catholic Church. The Church has faced periods of plague before, and it has had to wrestle with many of the same questions. We're going to unpack that and try to sketch the contours of the tension in this week's show. However, there is also other Vatican news bubbling out there. The Vatican recently announced, and then 24 hours later took back, a new human resources office that was billed as a critically important step in Pope Francis's Vatican reform. We will try to make sense of that development. And recent days have also seen a fairly rare public spat between two princes of the Church over the Vatican's deal last year with China over the appointment of bishops. And so we will also tell that story. So those are the headlines we're going to be talking about this week. Now stick around for the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
Okay, let us begin with the coronavirus. Obviously, the coronavirus is the major global headline of the moment. We are talking about a pandemic that has driven one country after another to adopt a series of progressively more restrictive measures. And has produced an economic freefall around the world and so on. These consequences are all well known. However, it is also producing massive consequences in Catholic life, and Italy is sort of a laboratory for what is happening. Let me just give you a brief tick-tock of what has happened here in Italy. The first public acknowledgement of a coronavirus case in Italy was in late January. The pandemic early on was concentrated in the north of the country, especially the Lombardy region, the center of which is Milan, which is Italy's economic and in some ways cultural capital. In February 23rd, the Italian government declared 11 communities in northern Italy red zones, that is, effectively placing them under quarantine. 2 days later, on February 25th, it announced the suspension of all public meetings, the closings of museums and cinemas and theaters. It suspended all extracurricular activities in schools in those red zones. March 1st, further restrictions were announced, mostly having to do with creating limitations on the ability to move around for motives of work. On March 4th, all schools, universities, and offices were shut down in those red zones. On March 8th, the red zones were expanded to include the entire region of Lombardy and 14 other northern provinces, putting essentially those regions under lockdown. 16 million people were affected by those restrictions. March 11th, so just 3 days later, the Italian government, under Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, announced that those restrictions were being extended to the entire country. So, in effect, all of Italy became a red zone. And on the same day, the Italian Bishops' Conference, known by its Italian acronym CHE, announced that all public masses would be suspended in Italy, so that on Sundays, there would no longer be Mass for people to go to. People were invited to practice the traditional Catholic devotion of spiritual communion, that is, perhaps watching the Mass on television, or at least expressing in prayer a desire to God for the Eucharist and producing at least some of the grace that regular reception of the Eucharist produces. On March 12th, the Vicariate of Rome, that's the agency that governs the Diocese of Rome on behalf of the Pope, because of course, remember, the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome, the Vicariate announced that all churches in Rome would be closed, whether they were in use as a parish church or not. So not merely that Mass would be suspended, but that churches would literally be shut down, closed to the public. Now, the next morning, March 13th, when Pope Francis celebrated his daily Mass, he began by saying that not all drastic measures are good, and emphasized that the holy, faithful people of God must not be left alone in this moment of crisis. Later that day, March 13th, Italian Cardinal Angelo de Donatis, who is the Pope's Vicar of Rome, issued a second decree saying that it was being issued on the basis of a conversation he had had that morning with Pope Francis, announcing that parish churches could in fact remain open, and he was entrusting to the mature consciences of pastors and the faithful whether to go to those churches and under what circumstances. Masses, remember, remain suspended, but the churches themselves, as places of prayer, would remain open. So that brings us to where we are now. As I said at the top of the show, there is clearly a kind of burgeoning, I wouldn't call it a debate because this is really not being hashed out in public, but there clearly is a tension that many Catholic pastors, many ordinary Catholics, so at the leadership level and at the grassroots, feel about the right way to respond to the exigencies of this pandemic. And this is because there are two competing, obvious, and urgent values at stake. On the one hand, there is the need to not create conditions under which the disease might be transmitted. There is the need to protect public health and to join in the sacrifices that everyone else is being asked to make in terms of not leaving the house, not having public events, maintaining appropriate distances between people, and so on. And certainly nobody on the church side wants to play dice, so to speak, with people's health, with their welfare. And the risks here, in terms of what might happen, in terms of continuing to have public religious events, have been illustrated in southern Italy in the region of Campania, that's south of Naples, so therefore considerably south of Rome, where 4 communities there have been they're small places, a total population of not more than 23,000 people, but these 4 small communities have been placed under quarantine after there was an unusual spike in coronavirus infections there. It has been traced back to a retreat that was held in late February by the Neo-Catechumenal Way. That's one of the new movements in the Catholic Church that specializes in post-baptismal faith formation for adults, both for people who were already in the church and those who have become distant for the church. It's had great success at that. It's considered one of the motor forces, so to speak, of the church's new evangelization. They held this small retreat, only for about 20 people, in late February. A 76-year-old man who attended that retreat later tested positive for the coronavirus, and a few days later he died. His wife also tested positive. She is under quarantine. All of the people who took part in that retreat had to be tracked down by public health authorities and given coronavirus tests. It is a sort of cautionary tale, I suppose, about the risks of continuing to bring people together in this time of pandemic and of concern about transmitting the disease. Those retreats, by the way, of course, were intended to prepare people for Lent. Now, the other competing value here, however, is that especially in moments of crisis, especially in moments of sickness and spreading sickness, of fear, people feel the need for the consolation that the church can offer. They feel the need for the support of the sacraments. And one sees in Pope Francis the attempt to sort of balance these two things. The Pope, every day, in some form or another, has found a way to call on people to observe all the common sense precautions recommended by the Italian government. During his Mass, he has prayed for the healthcare workers and the police and other deliverers of essential services who are, in effect, risking their lives in order to bring those services to the people who desperately need them. And so he has recommended compliance with most of the restrictions, the precautions that health authorities and the political leadership of Italy have decreed. But at the same time, he has also called on priests to be courageous in visiting the sick, providing support for the sick, in making making themselves available to deliver pastoral care to the people who need it. You saw him push back at the closure of all the Roman churches. And over the weekend, one of the personal secretaries of Pope Francis, a Coptic Catholic priest from Egypt, Father Yusuf Gaid, posted a message on WhatsApp to some of his priest friends in Rome, warning that once this is all over, people might abandon the church if they felt that the church abandoned them in their hour of greatest need. Now, Father Gaid emphasizes that Pope Francis did not see that message in advance, did not approve or green-light it, but nevertheless, it is taken as reflecting some of the thinking in the circles around the Pope, anyway, about the right way to respond to this crisis. So, as this situation plays itself out, no doubt, very hard choices are going to have to be made. They will have to be made at the retail level by individual pastors who will have to decide the circumstances under which they will make themselves available to people in order to comfort the sick, celebrate the sacraments, and so on. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, last Sunday, my wife and I were trying to decide what we would do for Sunday Mass. And we had kind of resigned ourselves to the inevitability of perhaps making our Sunday observance watching the Pope's live stream Mass that morning. Then, Saturday night, some friends of ours here in Rome told us of a parish where the pastor had sort of quietly told some people that he was going to say Mass that morning, and he was not going to announce it for fear that might either constitute a violation of the decrees of the Bishops' Conference and the Vicariate of Rome, or that it might attract the attention of the police or other civil authorities in town. So it would only be a handful of people, and all the standard precautions would be maintained. That is, we would maintain the 1 meter distance among ourselves recommended by the health authorities here. Communion would be distributed only on the hand, and so the sign of peace would be skipped, and so on. And so we decided to attend that Mass. I have to tell you, it had a little bit of the feeling of a kind of catacombs experience. We had to think about, what would happen if we got stopped by the police, for instance, who asked us why we were moving around town. And going to church is not recognized as a legitimate excuse at the moment. In the end, none of that happened. We attended Mass, and it was fine. But the point is that these are the kinds of hard choices that pastors these days are forced to make. These choices also, of course, have to be made at the leadership level. I think Pope Francis in particular right now, in a sense, is kind of caught between, on the one hand, not wanting to put people's health at risk and wanting to collaborate with public authorities in their fight against this pandemic, but on the other hand, wanting to remind people that the life of faith, from the point of view of a believer, is every bit as much an essential service as grocery stores and pharmacies. And he obviously doesn't want to create the impression that the church and its pastors simply ran away and went into hiding in a moment when people needed them the most. These are extraordinarily difficult judgment calls to make. We will see how they play out. Looking forward, of course, we are less than a month away from Holy Week, and it is not quite clear yet exactly how the Vatican is going to play it. Over the weekend, the prefecture of the papal household, that's the office in the Vatican that generally handles the logistics for public papal events, and specifically handles the allocation of tickets for those events, posted a short item on its own website indicating that the liturgies of Holy Week would be celebrated without the physical presence of the faithful. In other words, that there would be no people, no ordinary mass goers at these liturgies. And that got picked up by Vatican News, which is the official news outlet of the Vatican, and sort of made the rounds of the world. A few hours later, we got a statement from the Vatican spokesman, Italian layman Matteo Bruni, saying that actually the modalities, that is, the way in which Holy Week would be celebrated at the Vatican, is still under study. That is, it's being considered. And that they would make an announcement once a decision is reached. Now, the likely explanation here is that the prefecture of the papal household was trying to give people a heads up with plenty of advance notice that if they have tickets for these events, they may not be able to use them, and that they probably should not be requesting tickets for events that might not happen. At the same time, I think the Vatican is also trying to wait as long as possible to see what the epidemiological situation in Italy actually is. Recall that the restrictions imposed by the Italian government, this nationwide lockdown, technically is set to expire on April 3rd, which is the Friday before Palm Sunday, unless the Italian government decides that the situation requires extending them. The Vatican may well, in a sense here, be playing for time and leaving itself the option of allowing at least a limited number of people to participate in these liturgies if the situation at that point is such that the Italian authorities feel that they can begin easing some of these restrictions. So I think the only good advice there is wait to see. The one thing we do know for sure is that the Vatican has confirmed that Pope Francis will celebrate all of the liturgies of Holy Week. They will be live streamed and broadcast as normal, so that Catholics and others all around the world who want to follow those liturgies will still be able to do so. All right, that's the coronavirus situation for the moment. Obviously, it is the dictionary definition of a moving picture. We will continue to stay on top of it at Crux and also here on the John Allen Show for the Word on Fire Institute. Now, briefly, two other Vatican stories worth having on your radar screen. One, last week, the Vatican announced in its official daily news bulletin that it was creating a new Directorate for Personnel within the Secretariat of State, that is the most important central coordinating department of the Vatican with a kind of oversight authority over everyone else. And that Department for Personnel, which is essentially tantamount to a human resources office, was described as a critically important step, a critically important step along the path of reform laid out by Pope Francis. And it was responding to several things that most people who are close observers of the Vatican know well. One is that the Vatican has a sort of bloated payroll. That is, it has a payroll that is unsustainable given its financial means. Among other things, the Vatican faces a looming pension crisis, which could consume every last euro in the Vatican within a generation if it is not addressed. And so that payroll is going to have to be trimmed. This HR office, if it had the same function as HR offices elsewhere, would be part of that effort. Second, the Vatican also faces a challenge of how to shape a smaller workforce in a way that it becomes more productive and that it can contribute to providing the essential services, of course, that the Vatican has to provide. One way to do that is to have an effective system of evaluation. Thing is, a system of performance evaluation has never existed in the Vatican. In fact, for virtually every position in the Vatican, there isn't even a job description with a clear sense of what the expectations of that position are, and therefore how to measure whether those expectations are being met. An HR office would play an important role, probably a lead role, in creating such a system. And then finally, if you have a smaller and more accountable workforce, you somehow have to give people the skills to function in that new environment, which means a commitment to ongoing professional formation. That is also something that an HR office typically would do. Now, the question is Whether this HR office would be equipped to do that, the statement announcing it said that it would be. However, in an extraordinary reversal, 24 hours later, the Vatican issued another statement in which it indicated that, in fact, that HR office had not been created, that it was simply the idea, the proposal of a couple of cardinals, Cardinal Reinhard Marx of Germany, who is the chair of the Council for the Economy in the Vatican, and Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga of Tegucigalpa in Honduras, who is the chair of the Pope's own Council of Cardinals leading the reform, that the Pope had not made a decision about whether to do this. He would evaluate it, and if he judged it to be opportune and a good idea, he would eventually create it himself. So, how do you explain what can only be described as a rather remarkable flip-flop? It seems clear that there is an internal division within the Vatican about the right way to handle those three exigencies I just described. That is, cutting the workforce, creating a meaningful system, creating job expectations and a system for evaluation, and then professional formation. There's a debate over how to do it. There's a debate over who should be doing it, who should have the authority to do it, and so forth and so on. And it would seem that debate is unresolved, and the Pope has decided to buy himself some time. We will see what the eventual destiny of this HR office is, but regardless of what bureaucratic solution Pope Francis and his advisors decide to adopt, those three to-do items are make and break issues for the success of the Vatican reform to which Pope Francis has pledged himself, and so definitely worth keeping an eye on. Finally, two cardinals crossed swords recently. Since the Vatican announced a deal with the authorities in China over the appointment of bishops, which affords the government a role in the selection of bishops. This is intended to avoid a situation that we have seen ever since the communist takeover in 1949, of, in some cases, a government-sponsored Catholic Patriotic Association will name bishops that are not approved by Rome. In other cases, Rome would name bishops that are not approved by the government. That has, in effect, created a situation of two parallel churches in China, a kind of internal cleft or even schism. And this is an effort to close that era and to reunify the church in China, put it on a more solid footing. Now, there have been many critics of that deal who believe that it gives too much away to the communist authorities in China, that it basically throws the baby out with the bathwater. Probably the leading such critic has been Cardinal Joseph Zen, the retired bishop of Hong Kong, who has used kind of Cold War language in describing this deal as a form of appeasement of the Chinese authorities. Recently, the head of the Vatican's, of the College of Cardinals, the new dean of the College of Cardinals, Italian Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, who over the course of his career has held virtually every job the Vatican has to offer. He is a long-time Vatican heavyweight, wrote a letter to Cardinal Zen in which he essentially told him to be quiet. Saying that this criticism is not helpful, you should get behind the Holy Father, and further insisted that the deal that was signed by Pope Francis was actually in the works in the era of Pope Benedict XVI, that Pope Benedict knew about it and approved it, and that it represented the continuation of a kind of rapprochement with China that was also very much the policy of the papacy of St. John Paul II. In response to that letter, Cardinal Zen wrote back, basically telling Cardinal Re to put up or shut up, saying if it is true that you have archival evidence that Pope Benedict approved this deal, then show it to me. And further suggested that Pope Francis is being manipulated when it comes to his China policy by Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who is the Vatican Secretary of State. This is a charge Cardinal Zen has made several times before. He essentially believes that Cardinal Parolin, his team at the Secretariat of State, are far too eager to make deals with China. Cardinal Zen has said that China understands only strength and that the Vatican ought to be taking a much tougher line. Now, that is essentially where things were left, indicating, therefore, that this disagreement between Cardinals Ray and Zen, and more broadly between the kind of Vatican establishment and its critics over China, remains unresolved. One of the interesting footnotes to this story, by the way, is that while this debate over the Vatican's deal with China rages on, in some ways, we don't actually know what the debate is about because the terms of that deal have never been rendered public. We have not gotten the full text of the provisional agreement, either from the Chinese authorities or from the Vatican. Now, this is also a sore point among critics, who cite various international conventions, Convention of Vienna, and so on, that make secret agreements between states theoretically illegal, or at least a violation of the traditional diplomatic rules of the game. On the other hand, both China and the Vatican insist this is not really a formal treaty. It is a provisional agreement. They're not obligated to release it, and to date, they have not yet done so. We will see whether the pressure created by this kind of riff between two princes of the church adds to the pressure on the Vatican side, at least, to communicate at least something more than we have seen about the terms of the deal. Although it is unlikely that that is going to happen as long as the coronavirus continues to essentially blot every other story out of the sky and bring major social institutions, including the Vatican, if not to a complete standstill, at least to a kind of skeleton crew, which means that a lot of ordinary business is simply going to have to wait that moment for which the entire world is waiting, in which we can say that a corner has been turned on this extraordinary pandemic. All right, you can find the full background on all of those stories on the Crux site. Once more, that is cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com. During this period of lockdown, during this time of quarantine in which we are all urged to minimize going out of the house, and most of us find ourselves in one way, shape, or form under a kind of form of isolation. This is a terrific time not only to be reading Crux, but also to be checking out all of those marvelous resources you can find from the Word on Fire Institute. It is wordonfire.institute. Once again, wordonfire.institute. Thanks for watching The John Allen Show. Please tune in next week. In the meantime, have a fantastic, blessed week. Stay safe. And Maria, Salus Populi Romani. Mary, health of the Roman people, pray for us in a time of plague. God bless. See you soon.